Welcome to Hacktics and Telemetry, a Rapid7 produced podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Douglas McKee. And since Jonah this week, or CryptoCat, decided it was more important to go on vacation and go gallivanting across Asia with a bunch of hackers, I get the pleasure of being joined by Jacob today, one of our senior pen testers here at Rapid7, to be your co-host. Jacob, thank you for joining us again.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me back on. Looking forward to getting into today's content.
Absolutely. We've got some good stuff lined up for you today. For those that have not joined us for the podcast before, we have a pretty standard format. So we will start with the Situation Room, which is the place where we're going to go over some of the latest and greatest news since the last time that we had an episode and give you our opinions on what's going on that front. And of course, that means we're going to talk a little bit about AI because that's what's always happened in the latest news. And then we will move to the War Room component, which is my personal favorite part of the show, where we will bring on a guest. We've got one heck of a guest lined up for you today. We have Ismael Valenzuela joining us. He is an industry legend when it comes to everything blue team threat modeling, and we're going to get a chance to sit down with him and talk about some of his perspectives on what's going on in the industry and some of the ways that we can potentially protect ourselves and just general great cybersecurity knowledge. And then we will go over to the Mitigation Minute, where we'll wrap up, because we don't want to leave you with only problems. We want to provide you some solutions. So we'll talk about what we think potentially are some of the solutions to the issues we've talked about throughout the rest of the episode. As always, please like and subscribe, comment down below if you can, on whether on YouTube. We're also on Spotify now. Would love to hear your thoughts on how we're doing as far as what we're covering, maybe some suggestion on things that you'd like us to cover or different ways to approach the content. We will be happy to integrate those thoughts into upcoming episodes. Before we jump in here, I always think it's fun to talk and maybe be an observer in the industry when there's all different types of drama going on in cybersecurity. So, Jacob, did you find any drama this week in cybersecurity?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a bit of trouble in paradise, so to speak. We were all excited on a Friday afternoon, leaving for the weekend, that we were going to be getting access to Fable 5 and Mythos level models.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Anthropic. Public release of the new latest and greatest AI models from Anthropic.
Yeah, nothing can go wrong there. And then we come back in Monday morning, and the office is abuzz about how it's going to be blocked for anyone outside of the US.
They didn't give us access very long, huh?
Yeah. No, that block didn't end up coming into place. I think what had happened, there was a bit of miscommunication, or sort of a bit of a false positive, so to speak, in terms of, I think US government departments were worried that there may have been a jailbreak level issue with Fable 5. But whenever the Anthropic team got their hands on it and started digging into it a bit, they didn't find the same issues. So we've still got access to these models, I'm happy to say.
That's good. Nothing like the US government helping create an extra little bit of drama when it comes to AI models. So we'll have to keep Yeah. We'll have to keep an eye on that ever evolving situation. But I'll tell you what, why don't we go and take a deeper dive into the news, and we'll jump into the Situation Room. How about it?
Yeah, cool. Let's go.
All right, let's do it. All right, welcome to the Situation Room, and we've got some interesting content to cover today. There's been a lot that's happened since last time we did a podcast, so we're going to go ahead and dive right in. We've got some stories picked out. On one hand, it's kind of like, I don't know, Jacob, I feel like the stories that we have are more of the same, a different week in a sense, and some of the numbers get increasingly scary, I suppose. So speaking of numbers, I think there's some very interesting numbers going on with this vulnerability or situation. I don't know, it's more than just a vulnerability. I'm going to share my screen here on this FortiBleed incident. We like our names in the industry. So here we go. This is just a standard bleeping computer article on FortiBleed. This all comes back, I think, from 2014 when we had Heartbleed. Was that the first time that I think it was we used this nomenclature, I think? But the idea is that when you have that, the bleed part of this is that something can be leaked, usually sensitive information. So looking at this, the headline is FortiBleed exposes Fortinet VPN credentials for 73,000 devices. That's just a few devices. That would be pretty significant in itself. So here you can say this says 73,000. The exact number 73,932 firewall users at the organization worldwide, and it's affected quite a few major organizations. I think the hilarious part is that Fortinet itself was one of the domains that that potentially got leaked. So this was like so here you can see thousands of vendors instances are listed in files like the screenshot. This is the one has 21,634 domain names from Chevron to Fortinet itself with potentially working passwords. Jacob, you don't need to have Mythos or AI finding the latest and greatest vulnerability for you if you have the password list.
Yeah, sometimes it's the old methods that work the best. You see these issues coming up time and time and again. Very hard to defend against.
Yeah, I mean, threat actors, especially nation-state threat actors, they're not generally short on cash, and if they can just buy credentials, man, they're just gonna walk right into your network. So here's a screenshot of some of the credentials found during the attack. But I want to get into some of these other numbers because I think these the numbers on this is impressive. So if you look down here, it says according to the investigation, attackers allegedly conducted approximately, hold on, there's a B here, 1.16 billion credential attempts against 320,777 FortiGate devices, and believed to be a target an additional 2.1 billion attempts. Holy moly, bro.
Crazy numbers. That's terrifying.
Yeah, that's a lot of attempts across 163,650 Microsoft SQL servers. I think one of the things you can talk about when you see those massive numbers of attempts, whether it's with whatever it is definitely again an influx of how we have automation and faster GPUs and things like that to help us do those attempts. Everything kind of comes together on that.
Yeah, I've used some of those crazy GPU based hash cracking clusters before, and they're pretty powerful. Like they're terrifying how quickly they can crack a hash. And
this was not a specific geo event. You can see here that it's talking about across 194 countries and impacts 21,632 unique domains. So this was something where there were a lot of passwords exposed. Now, if you dig down into the technical details of this, and I don't remember if it's in this article or not, but if you take a look at really what's happening is it comes down to a old hash version that was known to be able to crack that was left, and supposedly the vulnerability was patched, but when it was originally patched, what you didn't see is they didn't go back and prevent that weak hash mechanism of being used for the passwords. I think that's a particularly unique element of this issue, isn't it? Like even after patching, people were still vulnerable. I feel like I agree with you. I think that's a unique element to this for sure, but I also think we're starting to see that a little bit more and more, where we have a situation where there is an organization releases a patch, right? But the patch fixes the issue moving forward, but it doesn't necessarily go back and retroactively prevent you from giving you protection. I can't remember exactly what episode we were talking about here not all that long ago, but the idea of if they're already on your box and you patch it, then the patches, yes, you may have prevented a future compromise, but they're already there. I think this is similar in that regards. And the idea of the credentials were already stored in a vulnerable format, and the update prevented you from storing future credentials in the vulnerable format. But if you didn't go back and clean up or redo those credentials, I think that's one of the reasons why the numbers are so massive here. What do you think?
It's something that as a member of the internal red team, whenever we compromise the system, we're always looking, okay, you need to patch the vulnerability that we were able to exploit, but you need to also think that if there are credentials or secrets held on wherever we've gained the foothold, then they could have been available to attackers for as long as that vulnerability has been existing on the system. So we always say, if we've got in there, you're best off rotating your credentials and your secrets on those devices, just to be sure. And obviously you can try and detect indicators of compromise beforehand, but it's always best to rotate your secrets whenever this sort of issue's been in your ecosystem for a while. I mean,
indicator of a compromise, man. If the attacker's got your passwords, what's the indicator of compromise? They're just logging in, looking like regular Joe coming in to do VPN firewall maintenance. So yeah, I agree. I think that also highlights a point on why it's so important to understand more or to read like the entire advisory or to read technical blog write-ups that are released by researchers on what the vulnerability actually is, because we so get trapped in this mindset of, oh, well, okay, I applied the patch, I'm good. Well, not understanding what the vulnerability was to begin with doesn't give you the information you need to go forth and actually patch it.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so this was an interesting one. Let's talk about some other news that happened this week. What do you think? How about we do the Microsoft one next? That sounds like a.
So I'm going to switch over. That's very. If this was an old legacy attack come back to haunt people, this is something straight out of 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really interesting, and this talks to the whole AI era as well, and how when we connect things that were not necessarily intended to be connected, we change security models, right? And we change threat models that may have been secure before, but now because we're using them in different ways, that threat model no longer holds up. I talk all the time when I'm talking about product security testing, right? Like the goal of product security testing is to understand the delta from yesterday to today that you introduce a new product. And effectively, that's what's happening here is a new capability has been introduced. In this case, we're talking about AI agents. And that new capability has changed the threat model. And if you have not gone in and evaluated what that threat model is, you're going to end up with something like this. So anyway, what am I talking about? So this is an interesting article released by Microsoft called AutoJacking. And it has, if you can see here, their ongoing research in the AI agent framework identified an exploit chain in AutoGen Studio. AutoGen's an open source prototyping user interface that allows untrusted web content rendered by a browsing agent to reach a local model context protocol MCP WebSocket and spawn arbitrary processes on the host. Well, yeah. Now you're on the local host, right? So what does this mean? We call this AutoJacking. Jacks the agent into becoming the attacker's last mile delivery vehicle by crossing the local host trust boundary that many developers rely on to tool. So what's your thoughts on this, Jacob?
I think it's pretty interesting. In the title, they use the term, your agent, because whose agent is it really? There's a lot of variables that go into these agents between like different instructions files or skills, access to different MCP servers. Like all of those different inputs have a say in how that agent operates. And if you don't trust all of those entirely, or if you're not in full control of all those, you're not in full control of the agent. I think that's a real key takeaway from a lot of these auto-jacking or agent jacking or, whatever title you want to give this week's exploit that attacks an agent.
I also, again, I think it's one of those things like sometimes we get caught up in whatever the big media story is. And like when AI first came out, well, I don't want to say first came out, but when we started talking about security with AI, the big headline was this idea of prompt injection, right? And it was prompt injection. And I think what's happened here is sometimes we treat AI agent security as a prompt injection problem. And what I think this is showing is it fundamentally changes the assumption about trust boundaries that AI introduces. And I think that's something that we've got to pay a little bit more attention to, is that, it's not internet facing. So like it can't hurt me. Well, if you've got an agent on a box that has internet access and has access to your local stuff, you've kind of bridged that, you've bridged that problem. I think it's another interesting conversation too, to talk about some of these AI browsing capabilities.
Yeah, because essentially a lot of the time if you're asking to perform a task, it's performing a quick web search to find out how it should perform that task and what is that content. I've seen instances where old attacks are essentially being reborn. You used to get these articles that were targeting developers saying like, here's how you install whatever dependency you want, but it's actually a link to their malicious server to install an exploit or a C2. And now agents are going out and finding those links. So whenever you're trying to just install a dependency through an agent for your project, it's grabbing these old exploits and trying to run them. Pretty interesting. Like.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same concept too. We keep seeing about web page embedding instructions for agents and then getting agents to execute malicious code on a system because they've posted on a website that they know that the agent is going to go look at, right? Same concept. Yeah. This whole world of AI agent security is that if your agent is a trusted entity that you've installed either, somewhere on your network in some way, shape, or form, or given access to some way, shape, or form. Shoot, we've got browser extensions now that are doing this and all of that. And if it goes out and it thinks it's getting a prompt, now I was just made the point that prompt injection is not the only thing to think about. I'm coming back to it a little bit, but I think it's it's still up there, right? And it goes back to these new ways of drawing trust boundaries. So I think it's an interesting thing to consider is, what has changed, and Microsoft here is proving, at least in this AutoGen studio software, that we can bridge the gap between what's local and what's not local. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into one last article here. Let's talk about, what do you think? Should we talk about Splunk? Was interesting this week. Should we let's go around? Let's go ahead and talk about some Splunk, and we'll use our favorite friends over here at Watchtower Labs. They always produce some fantastic blogs. We've shown a bunch of them here before, but they took a deep dive into this, and I always respect Watchtower calling out all different aspects of problems when it comes to these vulnerabilities and how vendors have put them out there. There was something in the very beginning about this vulnerability that if you were a researcher or you have a long history with understanding CVSS scores, that kind of stood out to you, right? So I'm going to start there really quick, and they call this out really early in the article here. So you can see here on June 10th, Splunk published an advisory for this CVE. This is the one we're talking about, CVE 2026-20253. And it says unauthenticated arbitrary file creation and truncation in a Postgres sidecar service endpoint in Splunk Enterprise. What's interesting here is that the score for this is a 9.8. And so to get a 9.8, certain things have to be true. Right. So here, and they call this out here in their article, we've got no authentication requirements and almost when they say full mark CVSS score, they basically mean almost a 10.0, right? So there's very little preventing this from being the highest possible. Claims to be a security product, that's a whole different conversation.
They're so funny the way they phrase things sometimes in Watchtower.
Yeah. Security products are often the most ignored resources by the security team, which is also another interesting point here. But the questions they come up with is no mention of RCE. Mm-hmm. Typically, when you've got something that's a 9.8, and this is only talking about arbitrary file creation. Obviously, arbitrary file creation can lead to a big deal, but typically that's not going to be a 9.8 if that's it. If all you can do is file creation, 9.8 definitely smells like more something like an RCE. So Jacob, did you dig into this at all? Tell us about what their analysis was and why it was a 9.8.
Yeah, they target all the right questions in this article. First of all, what can you write? And where can you write it? That's always a big issue with arbitrary file writes. If you can't change the file path, maybe not such a big deal. If you can't control the contents of the write, maybe not such a big deal. But the Watchtower team really dig into it here, and they find a couple of different methods through, and I'd recommend anyone goes and reads the article in detail, but they show fairly quickly that they're able to access an API endpoint for the Postgres service, and then they're able to identify how that's mapped, and I think they use an agent for doing it, for helping them with this, how that Postgres endpoint, it's exactly in that screenshot, how that Postgres maps to external facing API endpoint that they can access through the Splunk login portal without authentication. So they access that, then they find, okay, what can we do here? I think there's a backup and restore feature, and they realized that they're able to control that backup file. And initially their testing shows that they're basically able to write a blank file to an arbitrary location on the file system. So at that point, they're like, okay, interesting, we can overwrite files, we can create new files, but there's no content in them. And they go back in, they start digging through the documentation from the Splunk team. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. They find that there's actually a DB connection string, DB name connection string, where they're able to provide the location that the restore or backup file can be taken from. So they then are able to host their own malicious service that through this injection point, they're able to grab the contents from their own external service and write that to the arbitrary file. So now you've answered the two main questions right from the get-go there, that, okay, what can we write? We can write whatever we want now. Where can we write it? We can write it wherever we want. And now
pretty much game over at that point.
Pretty much game over. What they show in this article then is that they identify a Python script that is run by Splunk regularly, and then they show that they overwrite that Python script with their own malicious content. And simple reverse shell payload in that file will pop anytime it Splunk tries to run it, and you're getting RCE and direct access and a foothold into the victim's network. Insanely powerful and not immediately clear from the initial CVE, right? An arbitrary file, right? I mean, you need to be able to read between the lines a wee bit.
Yeah, I feel like there was a little bit, maybe, I mean, I'm not accusing anybody, but maybe there was a little attempt at obfuscation of making this feel like it's not as severe as it was. And definitely, when you get researchers digging into this stuff, going to kind of expose that for sure, once you actually understand the technical side of the vulnerability.
But it's important stuff. I mean, like, researchers aren't pointing this out to annoy people, it's for everyone's benefit if we know exactly what's going on, so people understand. I mean, okay, fair enough, it had the 9.8 CVSS, so that should tell people it's a serious issue that needs to be patched immediately. But I mean, if you're able to demonstrate exactly how RCE is achievable, then to me that rings a lot clearer than a 9.8.
I think we're on the same page there. And obviously at Rapid7 we believe publishing as much information as possible for defenders to have. That's why we publish Metasploit modules, working POCs, things like that, because there, even as we mentioned, like on the last issue that we were talking about, like with FortiBleed, right? Like it comes down to really understanding how the vulnerability works in order to truly protect yourself, because oftentimes it's more than just a patch it scenario. And I mean, that's what we love to say in the industry is patch, which is, I'm not taking away from that. Obviously we want to patch, but there's oftentimes more to it than that. And so I think, this is another highlight here.
You might want to look for indicators of compromise, if you were affected by this. So you need to know, okay, were they writing arbitrary files or did they have full RCE within my network? You're looking for quite different,
two different things,
indicators there. I think there was an interesting point in that as well. In one of, I think it was in the CISA write-up on it, that they were able to discover 1,400 externally facing Splunk instances that were accessible and that would have been affected by this. So
I was just going to mention that. Like, that's wild to me, right? So like we're talking about a technologies that should never be faced to the internet, which should bring down the severity of this, or like your exposure management concept here. But man, like to be able to find 1,400 of these publicly facing to the internet, that makes this a little bit more scary.
Yeah, big time.
Definitely another an interesting concept here. And I think
there was another point in this as well around the fact that it was so quickly weaponized as well, right?
Yeah.
I think and this is probably a running theme over a lot of vulnerabilities of the last couple of months, but the time from disclosure to weaponization is decreasing every week.
So yeah, I think to that point, if I'm not mistaken, I believe exploitation was cited on, so it was the vulnerability was released on June 10th. A POC was released on June 14th. I think was Watchtower the one that released the first POC? That I don't remember.
Might have been.
I don't, and I'm trying to see. Well, okay, so the Watchtower article was published on June 12th. So that provided all the technical details clearly, because it's very well outlined on here. I remember seeing in one of the CISA articles that 14th was like the first official POC release, and then it was June 18th they saw exploitation. So you're seeing end-to-end cycle advisory to exploitation agreed to by, like, validated by CISA, 8 days, 10th to the 8th.
Yeah. And in reality, I mean, the timelines are even more compressed than that.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, the reading between the lines there, it's actually way more compressed than 8 days. Like 8 days is actually a lot longer by the time you get all the reporting and official dates on the reporting. Like this was weaponized pretty quickly. And I think, to your point about the 1,400 exposed instances, when you first see something that you believe should be internal to a network, like as someone that, regularly is looking at vulnerabilities, you see the 9.8 score, you see the severity of it, but you're like, probably not something that threat actors are going to leverage to get initial access. So it takes it a step down a little bit, because you don't think it's going to be that initial access vector. But then to find out that it actually can be the initial access vector. The result of this is the attackers are in your security software using the software that you would use to detect them. They now have direct access to it. Like that brings it up to a whole new level, right? Like, and I think, so if I'm not mistaken, the CISA coming out on the 18th, I believe they put the patch deadline to this on a Sunday. Talk about ruining your weekend if you're a government system administrator there, right? Like,
yeah. Whenever we're running pen tests, I always hate disclosing an early critical report on a Friday, because I feel bad for the teams, but it has to be done sometimes.
Yeah, well, as long as we don't get another like Log4j on Christmas, right?
That's exactly what I was thinking there.
type event. All right. Well, hey, I think that wraps up some of the latest and greatest news for since the last podcast. Ironically, like I feel like a lot of it's same stuff, different day. As far what we're seeing, but a lot of different trust issues when we talk about AI, and a lot of continued targets of things like appliances, security appliances, and endpoints.
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm hoping that we'll maybe see a bit of movement in isn't necessarily the attacks we're seeing, but the mitigation measures, and maybe we can get into that a bit later. But I think that's where we're seeing a lot of
why don't we jump over to the war room, because our guest today happens to be an industry-renowned expert in mitigations and threat modeling, and we can ask him some of those questions.
Awesome.
All right, let's do it. All right, welcome to the War Room, and I am super excited this time to have one of my most favorite people in the world, friend, former coworker, Ismael Valenzuela, joining us as the guest for this week's episode. For those that don't know, Ismael is a senior SANS instructor. He's the author and instructor for Security 530, which maybe we'll talk about. I understand there's a new update to that class, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about the AI you've integrated into that, because that's what we talk about these days. Everything is talking about AI. He's also the VP of Threat Research and Intelligence over at Arctic Wolf, and he's also my co-author for the weekly newsletter called The Monday Brief, where we also talk about the latest and greatest news and what it means to you from an execution standpoint. So Ismael, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for agreeing to join us. You want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we dive in?
Sure. Thank you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. And we've been working together for quite a long time, right? Working, sharing projects. And
it's been a minute. I mean, it's probably double digits in years. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a few.
But maybe I'm going to blame this on, you being out of space, okay? Because like that changes things.
It does.
Now we didn't, for those watching, like we didn't talk about that at all. I didn't know that you were going to be in space, but I brought this,
There you go. Hey.
But just to clarify something, I'm Valenzuela, not Venezuela. It's close, right? But Venezuela is a country. It's a country, and
I've done that.
Yeah,
that's my bad, dude. I think I do that all the time to you.
But it was just because it's coming out of space. So that's
true. Yeah, it's the delay in the communication.
It's the delay in the communication. But very happy to be with you here. We've been talking about this for some time, and I love chatting with you. So
hey, before we get into the technical stuff, I know that you are a big, let me get this right, football fan, right?
Yes, that's right.
And we're in the middle of FIFA. So what's your perspective on what's going on right now?
Well, so I'm from Spain, born and grew up in Spain. So obviously, I would love to see Spain doing a good job. But World Cups, that's the fun thing of it. And so far, I cannot say that I've been watching every game. It's impossible, especially with the type of work that we do, right? But I've been enjoying it a lot. I was thinking that maybe the first few games were going to be a little bit more boring with some of these countries that are not that big into football. But no, like I've seen really nice games, and teams are very close to each other, so it's going to be interesting. But
I was hoping you were going to call me and tell me that you were coming to Dallas to watch the game, and we were going to go hang out in Arlington, but that didn't.
We still have time. But I would say this, since if you allow me, I was born in Malaga, right? That's my hometown, and I'm a big Malaga, football club fan. And as of just a couple of days ago, we just went back to first division. It was a huge thing for the city, like 200,000 people went out on the streets to celebrate. And they did this with, I think there's some business lessons learned with that too, with a bunch of kids, right? A bunch of kids that grew up in humble neighborhoods in the city. They defeated teams that were funded with a lot of money, funded by, Middle Eastern companies and with very, highly paid players. And they were beaten by these young kids that grew up in humble neighborhoods, right? So, maybe there's something to learn there, that it's not just all about throwing money and people to problems, but just, also getting hard work and humility sometimes beat that, right?
I think that's a great point. And in fact, there's something that that you coined as far as a mentality in the industry. Talking about mindset and how to overcome things that aren't just about money and humility and things like that. But there's a motto that you have called, and I've stolen it from you over the years because I say it all the time. But you were definitely an originator of it, and that is the Think Red, Act Blue mentality. So tell us a little bit about the origins of Think Red, Act Blue, and what that means in the security space.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. It's one of those things that I can't even remember when was the first time that I said it, or but it's something that I kept repeating, especially in class, in my science class, because that's a bit of the story behind me as well. My career, I started as a penetration tester doing ethical hacking when this was called information security, not even cybersecurity. There was no cyber in 2001. When I started to do these things, and that's something that has always helped me, because once you have done the offensive side of things, as you well know, it's easier to understand, right? What the flaws are, right? It helps you to think differently. And what I have seen throughout many years is that the defenders, they have been thinking more in terms of like products, solutions. What's the product that I have to do this, to do that? Compliance, frameworks, and that's always good, right? But that's not how attackers think. Sorry. So Think Red and Blue is essentially think as an attacker to become a better defender, like think out of the box. It's a little bit about empathy as well, like putting in somebody else's shoes, right, and try to see the world how they see it. And I think that it's a model that still helps. And 26 years into this career, it's still as valid as it was before.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about the mentality of the Think Red, Act Blue, one of the things I coin it as is the only thing that should separate us from the threat actors is what we do with that information and that skill set. That's the Act Blue part, right? The Act Blue part is not using it to become a ransomware gang, but using it to improve our defenses as part of that process. So I think it's a very valuable. I've also said before, the best blue teamers make the best red teamers, and the best red teamers make the best blue teamers, right? And that cross knowledge is just so vital to being able to defend your networks.
Yeah, that really resonated with me as well. I was a consultant pen tester for 5 years and then switched into Rapid7 last year. And as a consultant pen tester, I'm sure you'll know as well, it's like you have follow-up meetings with the clients, but a lot of the time it's kind of like hit and run. You find the issues, you point out the issues, and then you deliver the report. Whereas as an internal pen tester, you work much closer with the blue teams. Now, Think Red, Act Blue mentality is something that I find really invaluable over the course of this year.
Well, I think we're guilty on this podcast of doing a lot of thinking red and a lot less of acting blue. And so it's great to have you on as a guest that we can talk a little bit more on the acting blue side, both of maybe things that are going on in current events. But before we jump into some current event stuff, what have you recently updated in Security 530 that is the Act Blue component? So tell us about what are some of the latest and greatest maybe technologies or latest and greatest methodologies that we're looking towards to. You got the Think Red part on at least 2/3 of this call for sure. Tell us a little bit about what you would do in class to tell your students from an Act Blue portion.
Well, surprise, this is going to be completely unexpected. I added a lot of AI to the class. It makes sense, right? I mean, obviously, this is what everybody wants to see. And in my day job, right, like as a science instructor, like we always get these questions. Okay, this is how, as defenders, we can use AI, but also how are our attackers using AI? One of the things I like about this class is that it gives me an opportunity to demystify a lot of topics. I always say this on day one, like, hey, I'm going to be demystifying a lot of things for you. And the reality is, and we can maybe talk about this later as well, the way that attackers are using AI is to accelerate what they already did before, right? And automate, accelerate, not necessarily to do like things that we've never ever seen in the past. We talk about that. We talk about identity. Identity is obviously a very important factor. Well, we didn't talk about the topic of my class, but it's about defensible secure architecture and engineering based on zero trust principles. So guess what? How do you manage agents across the enterprise? They need to have an identity, right? They need to be dealt as non-human identities, right? And you need visibility, you need telemetry, you need governance around all of those things. One of the things I discuss a lot, and I've been talking about this for many years, it's reverse proxies are awesome, right? Proxies are awesome. Well, guess what? Now we talk about LLM gateways to proxy the traffic between an agent and that resource. What is that? It's just a proxy, a dedicated one, right? Building policy enforcement points and with policy decision points, using AI to orchestrate, to help automate and orchestrate some decisions for conditional access. So this, a lot more content around how to use AI strategically and tactically in these scenarios. But at the same time, all the fundamentals, all the principles on what makes a defensible security architecture and how to build it, they remain. They're still the same, right?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, how like, same stuff, different day. Like a lot of the technology changes, but a lot of the methodologies are effectively the same. In fact, now that you're mentioning like AI agents and the access and proxies, one of the things that we just talked about in the Situation Room was that new story that released by Microsoft called AutoJack. I think you might be familiar with it, where they've talked about the bridging effectively of an AI agent having internet access, then being able to access local host. And so now the APIs or things that have been only accessible traditionally to a developer on local host, the AI can access and kind of bridge that gap. So how do you talk about an architect around these new trust boundaries that are being redefined, if you would, from an AI perspective?
That's a great question. Yeah, we actually talk about that at the Monday brief, right? In one of the latest issues.
Yeah, in the commentary for sure.
Yeah, and it's funny. One of the things I've said for a long time is, hey, have you, when I talk to my students about this, I ask them, have you heard this before? If it's behind the firewall, it's secure, right? Don't worry, encrypting, don't worry. It's behind the firewall, it's secure.
No one's ever seen an any rule in the wrong place in a firewall, though,
right?
I'm sure.
That too. And I think that mentality has been shifting over the years, which is good. But there's still that concept that people have that, we have these controls in place, therefore this is secure. And this is another example of that. This is just listening to local host. It's not exposed to the internet. Sure, but is there a path to it? Again, that's the difference between the traditional defensive thinking based on controls, based on just adding protection layers, versus the attacker's mindset, the think red, which is if there's a path and that system is connected to something, I can get to it, right? It may take me some pivots, it may take me some time to map the environment to get there, but I can do that. Reverse proxies, again, or tunnels, or can give me a path into this asset.
You're bringing up an interesting point. It struck me because you said time a couple while you're explaining that, and if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while, but you wrote an article, I want to say 10 years ago, on something called time-based security, and I feel like that's still really relevant here. So talk a little bit about how your perspective on time-based security and how that potentially maybe is even more relevant today than it used to be.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. This is not something I created. It was written by Wim Scharto, who's an author that wrote this in the 90s, like 96. And he laid out...
96?
Yeah, 96.
Oh, man, we're starting to date ourselves here.
Right? Yeah. And 30 years ago. And he was talking about how we can model cybersecurity in the same way that we model physical security. If you're going to be opening up a safe, right, or you're going to buy a safe to store valuables in there, jewelry or gold or whatever, what determines how effective is the security of that safe? It's essentially time, right? How long does it take to crack that open based on pressure, fire, different like threat elements? Same thing in cybersecurity. Prevention only buys you time, right? It doesn't matter how many walls we have in the building, how tall the building is, how many doors we have. Given enough time and given the absence of detection and response, anybody could just take their time and go through all of these, evade all of these blockers. But that's why we architect with prevention, right, or protection mechanisms, and in parallel we architect with detection and response. So that same idea, that's what I apply to the class as well. That same idea, it's still applicable to architecture and engineering in cybersecurity, even in the AI era.
I was going to say, so some would say in the AI era that time is collapsing, right? Like that everything is, the headlines are all saying acceleration, right? Acceleration. So do you think there's been any change in the time-based security model, or is the cycle shorter than it used to be? Like how do defenders apply the fact that time is even more valuable than it used to be, and kind of in a sense?
Absolutely. Now, even let's put ourselves into like an extreme scenario, right? Let's say that protection time now is gone down to 0, which is not the case, right? Because you could argue that, sure, if something is exposed to the internet, like you guys know mass scan, right? How long has it been out there for the last 10 years? And you can scan the entire of the internet, one TCP port at a time for, in less than 5 minutes. So everybody's been scanning everybody in the last 10 years and finding everything that is exposed on the internet. Now with AI, obviously that's even easier. But what this model says is that the more protection layers you have, the more opportunities to create choke points, to disrupt the attack, and to also have an opportunity to detect some activity. So protection still works. But let's be radical here and extreme, that protection time collapses down to 0. You still have opportunities to detect and react, right? All you need is one detection that is accurate, that is high confidence, to be able to detect the presence of the adversary or the AI offensive tool and react to it. So it still requires you to architect with this in mind, that you need to break the problem into smaller chunks. I like to say divide and conquer, right? And then add all of these little tripwires and sensors and security cameras and all of these things that could give you an opportunity to detect even a fully AI automated offensive tool.
Speaking of AI automated offensive and time collapsing, I know your team at Arctic Wolf had put at least a publication out on FortiBleed, and it was another big thing that's occurred recently. I thought we were just talking in a situation room a little bit about the numbers that came out with that release. I mean, the ability to, I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, I want to say scan, but like leverage like 1.6 billion devices and numbers like that. What are your thoughts on that event and how that's changed, how AI has affected that potentially?
I think that for those of us that we have been in the industry for a long time, it doesn't really surprise us, right? I mean,
there's been a lot of bleeds between now and 2014.
Right? Heartbleed, do you remember that one? 2014?
Of course. That's the original, right? I don't think, was there anything before Heartbleed that had that syntax?
And what was that? It was a vulnerability that allowed,
that was SSL. That was SSL. The leaking memory components from SSL. And you could leak sensitive information.
Exactly. Huh? So, and this applied to not just like a specific vendor, but any vendor out there that's open SSL, which is like everybody, right? But of course, like the scale, the ability to automate these things right now, it's staggering. And we just released some research as well on a harvester, and we disclosed like how the attackers are building their own labs to, which is funny. It's something that you and I, Dagan, we've been teaching for a long time, right? Like how to extract traffic out of these labs, create a PCAP, and then from the PCAP, like analyze it, extract information out of these binary formats, carve it out. And
man, I wish I would have had AI to write that Python code. What was it, 5 or 6 years ago when we were doing the proprietary protocol stuff?
Jupyter notebooks, put in Jupyter notebooks and things like that.
That would have been awesome to have Codex or something write that for me, because we went from what? We went from Scapy to Bro rules, and that was painful, to be honest.
It was fun too. It was fun. Anyway, so it's fascinating to see what they're doing, but at the same time, there's nothing really new. And what we're going to see is a lot more of these incidents. Like the scale, it's huge. It's interesting because I think people confuse what's the point with this. We have so many now news about patch this, patch that. Okay, FortiBleed, another one. Okay, tell me what I need to patch. It's like, no, this is not about patching. This is about, your whole identity, like program and how you manage it. And again, it's about strategy. It's about your defensible secure architecture. How do you see your architecture? How do attackers see your architecture? And making sure that you have enough layers. I keep saying defense in depth is not dead. It's just not enough. Defense in depth needs to be complemented with detection in depth, response in depth, and that requires strategy, which is one of the things I like to talk the most.
Well, to poke at one of your expertise and to talk about defense at depth, I've been quoted before saying that zero trust is not new. It's the rebranding of defense in depth. What are your thoughts on how zero trust and defense in depth and all that play into today's world?
Yeah. So defense in depth, a lot of people thought about this as, it's all about the definitions, the details, right? But if you define it as, I'm going to add a lot of protections, layer them, and that's good. I have all of these firewalls and all of these segments and all of these choke points and then IPSs, and then I have endpoint security, and I have all of these things to block bad stuff. Great, I'm good. I can go play golf all day long. If that's your definition of defense in depth, sure, that doesn't work, because as we said before, time-based security, right? That gives you time. But you're not really watching, you're not continuously monitoring the environment for changes, and not just alerts, but behavioral detections, deviations of what normal looks like. That's the hard part, right? And that's the thing that we say you have to architect in parallel with all these sensors, all the tripwires, all the cameras, and then adjusting your protection mechanisms based on those signals. That's what zero trust adds to the strategy, by adding continuous risk monitoring, continuous risk analysis, adaptive trust, where you can not just block some connection, but also continue watching a connection and then disrupting if something deviates from what normal looks like, and being able to take an action based on that.
Yeah, that's... Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, very interesting. And as part of the red team, I know that there's a lot of ways that we've accelerated our capabilities in terms of vulnerability analysis, writing exploit code and POCs. What are the top things that you think blue teams could do today to create the same accelerations for their protective measures? Is there anything that comes to mind?
That's a great question, and I hear a lot that from customers that ask the same question, students as well. Well, so it comes down to speed, right? But we were saying this in the past, even before AI, we had about 10,000 new vulnerabilities issued every quarter. You cannot patch absolutely everything, right? You have to strategize it. You have to prioritize. How do you prioritize? Based on your threat model. Your threat model is not just about the threats out there, but how do they affect you? What's the context of the business, right? And what are the systems that are more important to you? You need to have that context, and then based on that, let's assume that you cannot even defend against any of that. Again, let's take it to the extreme, right? There's always going to be somebody who is ahead of you in that game, and you're never ever going to be able to patch everything and protect every single asset. What do? Well, even in the best or the worst case scenario, in this case, the attacker needs that entry into your point of entry into your network, but that's not the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal is to do something with that. They have to map your network, they have to find where the data is, they have to hold get all of your credentials and hold the environment hostage. I'm seeing cases where attackers are breaking through identity attacks, breaking into cloud environments and stealing all the SharePoint data. There's always an objective, right? The whole attack chain. So the idea is that even if that happens, if you have the right controls in place, it's going to be difficult that the attacker can pull everything off, the perfect crime, without setting any alarms, right? I'm a big fan of, I'm going to say deception, right? But I'm a big fan of red herrings, tripwires, anything that could redirect the attention of the attacker during the attack chain. And I think it's more important than ever right now, even though it's not a new concept, right? But it's more important than ever because these tools, these AI tools, are programmed, designed for rapid compromise. And in that process, they inherently trust the signals around them. It's like, oh, I see this, I'll take it. I see this, I'll take it. Boom, 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 boom. Right? Because they're trying to follow that path. That is a huge advantage for defenders because you can drop tripwires, you can drop red herrings. These are things that the AI doesn't know, They do not know your environment, but you know your environment. And that could be the easiest and the fastest way to detect this type of behavior. If you have architected your network in a way that now you can react to it, sure, you may not be able to prevent the initial exploitation, which you still want to prevent as much as you can, but you will be disrupting the attack chain and protecting your organization, which is...
Is that kind of like the same thing as having a home court advantage in football? You know?
Right. What football are we talking about now, Doug?
I was assuming we were talking about your football,
okay,
not my
the real
football.
one. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You
set the playing field, basically.
You know your home field.
Yeah.
Field.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the term the perfect attack, and you talked a lot about like tripwires and things like that to force an attacker to trigger. I would argue we recently got some news. I think it was from Google that released the news originally. I might be wrong there, but someone almost pulled off the perfect attack where you had China that was linked to I can't remember who, but it was they were in a network for 2 years. I think the report said undetected. Like, does that basically show that maybe there weren't appropriate number of tripwires, or what's your thought on these long dwell times that we're seeing some advanced APTs being able to pull off?
That's a good question. In my class, for example, I talk a lot about let's say foundational things. Like you need to look at the syslog from your routers, from collect net flow data from your switches, and that is not sexy, if you allow me the expression. It's not like the coolest shiny object, like, oh, buy this AI powered whatever. But I have had conversations with other practitioners that are in the field doing this at scale as well, and they were telling me, Ismael, if people would look at their router logs, their syslog logs, and look at unusual behavior for the last 5 years, you would find the Volt Typhoons. You could find like the Sol Typhoon attacks, and it's not.
So you're saying it's not as much as those threat actors are super good at staying quiet, and it's more on defenders are not monitoring what they need to see to detect them in the first place?
In many cases, yes. In many cases. And of course, attackers take advantage of that. I'm not saying that some of these attackers are not sophisticated, right?
No, of course.
But to the point before, there's no such thing as a perfect crime. Attackers are not going to innovate in every single step of the attack chain. If something works, why would they change it, right? I usually say attackers are lazy. And
I guess if you're
testers, that, right? Not saying you guys are lazy, but
I guess
I'm absolutely admitting that I'm lazy as an attacker, 100%.
If your target list as an actual malicious actor is everyone, then you just figure out an attack chain that works, and you just go and search for it everywhere, and it's going to be somewhere, right?
Exactly. So I'm not saying it's easy, right, as a defender, but talking about demystifying things, I bought into this earlier in my career, right? This thing of, being a defender is so difficult because you have to be right every single time, and then attackers, they have to be right like only once. And then over the years, I was like, that is wrong. That is wrong. That is not correct. First of all, it puts you into the wrong mindset. I'm defeated already. Like, who's going to be doing a good job when you start with, I am defeated already? Right? Doesn't put you in the right frame of mind. And the second one is, it's not true. If you do it right, if you have the right architecture, right, the right segmentation, the right approach to how to combine protection, detection, reaction capabilities with products or solutions that you already have, you don't always need new stuff, and you combine it in the right way, you have a lot of opportunities to detect the presence of the adversary across the attack chain, which means that all you need is one high confidence detection, right? And reacting to that to disrupt the attack chain.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was actually busted a couple of times last year during Rapid7's red teams, and we had these great big exploit chains, and then we triggered something, and the SecOps team just wiped everything out, and we were back to square one.
Right. And you'll be surprised. I'm not going to share all the secrets here. I'm not going to spill all the beans, but sometimes it's looking for the simple stuff. The ease of things that gets you that alert that you're looking for. It doesn't have to be always that complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that you can flip that on its head and easily say that yes, the attacker only has to be right once, but so a defender only has to be right once as well. As you said, they only need that one high confidence alert to figure out what's going on. And Jacob, you just showed an example of them finding that one alert and then be able to completely set you back all the way back to square one. So the mantra probably goes in both directions.
But it requires preparation. In the same way that the attacker doesn't show up and say, okay, I'm just going to, pull off random stuff I've never tried before. Attackers don't do that. In fact, as a defender, one of the things I usually say is like, watch for the knock-knocks. Do you really think that, especially advanced adversaries, they're going to be just like show up all of a sudden without trying anything or testing anything first? No, they will test it before. Look for the knock-knocks across your edge infrastructure. These, attempted connections, unsuccessful. They may not be a lot of them, but they're coming from novel IPs, novel ASNs, geographies, things that you haven't seen before. And it's like, oh, there's nothing here, right? They were not successful. Yeah, watch them closely because they may come back, right? They're just knocking on your door, but they may come back at a later time.
Yeah, I think it's a huge misconception sometimes. Like the, threat actors / researchers, I say constantly, we spend 75, when I say we, I mean the red side of the house, offensive side of the house, we spend 75 to 80% of our time doing zero security work, right? We spend it trying to understand how an application or how a network works to be able to do the security work. Like to use your term, the sexy stuff is like 5% of what you're actually doing. What you have to do is you have to learn your network or application better than sometimes the developer itself knows it, to be able to find the holes in the threat model to pull off the attacks. And so if that's the case, there are going to be signs and there is time that threat actors are taking to do that research that you can leverage. They're doing the same amount of legwork you are on the defensive side. They're just doing it with again, think red, act blue. They're doing it with the opposite end goal in mind. That's really the difference there. But hey, Ismael, it's been a pleasure to have you on today, and I swear I learn something every time we talk, and so I always appreciate the chance.
What? Oh wow!
Yeah, we're going to wrap up here. We're running out of time here. We got to keep things moving. So, is there any last words of advice or things that you would like our viewers to know before we sign off?
Yes, and actually talking about Think Red Out Blue, I know of this newsletter that comes out every Monday morning, right? The Monday Brief. So check it out, themondaybrief.com. This is something that, Doug and I, we've been doing now for some time, and I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it a lot to talk about, what's happening every week. Commentary, we have guests joining us, and I think it's a great way of staying, updated with what's going on top of obviously watching the Situation Room.
Yeah, absolutely. If you enjoyed the commentary you heard here today, by the way, before I get bashed in the comments about trying to sell something on the podcast, what he's talking about is 100% free. You just go on and you get an email and it tells us you get a red and a blue perspective and sometime a guest perspective on recent news. So if you want to hear more from Ismael and you're willing to put up with a few things that I say as well, definitely go ahead and check that out. It's a good resource for you. Well, again, thank you so much for joining. We're going to call that a wrap for today, and hopefully maybe we'll get you on again in the future.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care. All right, welcome to the Mitigation Minute. This is the segment where we like to talk about how to protect yourself from the crazy stuff that's going on out there in the real world. So we touched a little bit on some of this in the Situation Room, but we want to make sure that we give it proper attention here. So starting with we'll talk through basically all three of the topics we mentioned in the Situation Room in no particular order, but talking first about the Fortinet vulnerability here, I think the real key takeaway from a defensive perspective is that patching does not automatically secure you from old vulnerabilities depending on what they are, right? And in this case, the biggest thing to remember was to rotate credentials or rotate secrets. And the other thing that I would say regarding that is if we take this and abstract this away from the Fortinet thing, it's about really you need the appropriate threat intelligence and research to actually understand what's going on with the vulnerability so that you know what those auxiliary or additional steps are to take when trying to protect yourself from that. Jacob, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's exactly that. It's having the expertise and knowledge within your team or within, your service provider's team, that they're able to relay these issues, not just like the raw patch content or the raw CVEs, but like build context around them and explain, okay, what needs to be done around just a simple patch.
Yeah, like in this case, going into your actual system policy and disabling legacy hashes, being specific to Fortinet is another step to take to ensure that you're on the right track.
I think it can be difficult for maybe small to medium organizations to have that kind of knowledge in-house sometimes, which is where like solutions and companies like Rapid7 really provide a lot of value to smaller businesses because we can help provide that to people.
Yeah, managed services for small businesses is definitely a huge way to go. I mean, it doesn't even have to be small, medium-sized businesses. We see a lot of very large enterprises supplement their security teams with managed services because you don't always have the expertise across every piece or every domain in cybersecurity. So definitely a good call out. If we turn and think about the AutoJack concept that Microsoft put forward, and actually, if we go back and look at other releases in the industry over the last several months, they aren't the first one to come up with a scenario where something that was considered or I should say that where an AI agent crosses a security boundary because it's connected to the internet and connected to your local machine. So, if we think about here, we went from, local host, it's not internet facing, it doesn't need additional authentication, it doesn't need additional checks, to the agent effectively breaks that model, right? It is potentially internet facing. So some things to think about here is, strict authentication for every local API endpoint, right? Making sure that you're still leveraging authentication for that, making sure that you're auditing what those developer environments are so that you know where those potential weaknesses and trusts are. Jacob, what do you got here for AI agents running on local systems? In fact, if I'm not mistaken, you see a lot of this in your current line of work, right?
Yeah. I mean, we've been building a lot of exploit chains that utilize this recently because it's something that we are proactively trying to engage with, right? We're trying to get ahead of the curve on this. So we've been attacking the agents from the day that we started using agents to understand where are the pain points and how do we begin to build defenses around them. In my role at Rapid7, I worked adjacent to the internal SOC and the security team. So I'm always trying to attack and then demonstrate how we attack so they can protect them. I mean, at the minute, we're looking at there's a lot of like kind of simple enough solutions that some people may not be thinking about, but the idea of never allowing auto approval on your agents. So it shouldn't just be allowed to run rampant and grab information from web resources and decide to try and run arbitrary commands that it's finding. But even if you have those auto approvals disabled, there are still approval settings stored in files that are often user permission files. So anyone that gets a user foothold on your machine could potentially backdoor your agent by setting approval rules that allow their malicious commands. So there's a lot we've been recommending for our engineering teams around, trying to stick to standardized IDE and agent environments. Don't let your engineering teams, every person's using a different IDE, a different agent. Try and stick to one. Have well formatted, standardized instructions and rules documents for your agents, and then try and monitor any changes that might signify, okay, someone has just altered an auto approval setting or an instructions file for one of the agents that maybe shouldn't be. And if possible, it gets a little bit more technical now, but like trying to isolate the blast radius by, in particularly high security scenarios, sandboxing your IDEs even and your agents, so that if something does run, it's only getting access to that sandbox environment and not, your host and all your source code or whatever.
Yeah, you kind of stole my next point there a little bit on the sandboxing thing, because what I was going to say, like in my personal setup, what I do is I don't run any agents that aren't on virtual machines. Like I don't run anything on local host. A little bit different from sandboxing, but effectively the same concept, right? Like if something was to exploit my agent or bypass, the security restrictions that are in place, they're still stuck in that virtual machine. There's none of my personal information on that virtual machine. I can, easily destroy it. Now, I'm not trying. Don't quote me wrong. Doug did not say that virtual machines are like the impenetrable security layer, right? That's not what I'm saying. But it definitely adds an additional layer to make things more difficult if an attacker was to get access. And as you said, contain that blast radius, right?
Exactly. Because, it's a simple solution that's easy for developers or maybe not very high security scenarios. You can implement something like that gives you at least a slight layer of protection.
Yeah, in vulnerability research, we do a lot with just keeping things in virtual machines to help limit that blast radius for sure. All right, well, before we run out of time, let's talk about the last one really quick. Let's talk about Splunk. I'm gonna take the easy win here, right? The easy win with Splunk is, this should be something that's not internet exposed. They found 1,400 machines exposed internet facing. Like that should immediately limit your exposure to this. Again, that's not the end all, the be all. Obviously, attackers get into your network of various different numbers of ways, and then they have that ability to leverage the Splunk Splunk device, whether if they're already in. But we can at least limit our exposure by making sure this security appliance should never be exposed to the internet, right? So, Jacob, besides my super easy suggestion here, help us out.
I mean, I would ask, first of all, the same question that the manager of the security teams or infrastructure teams are going to ask at some of those companies. Why is this externally accessible, right? And I mean, it could be that maybe someone didn't have the right knowledge around protecting it and putting it inside the VPN or within their trusted boundary. Could be, and I've seen this a number of times when I was a consultant pen tester performing external pen tests. Sometimes engineer or infrastructure teams, IT teams will temporarily make something accessible so that they can access it, and then forget to remove that temporary access, and it remains accessible for a longer period of time. So keeping an eye on your external footprint is something that's really important, and it's something that we value at Rapid7 and a service we provide through Vector Command, where essentially it's kind of like a 365 pen test where the teams are continuously monitoring your external footprint to see has anything new come online. So in an instant like this, they would catch that and they would say, okay, first of all, that shouldn't be online because that's a security service that should be behind your VPN. But also if an exploit comes out for it, they'll catch it immediately and it'll be reported and they'll be protected.
Yeah, definitely. Doing any type of continuous monitoring in pen test, Vector Command is definitely an excellent way to implement that. So, because like as you said, things change, right? And things pop up all the time, and it can be as innocent as like, oh, I'm doing this for 5 minutes so I can configure this one thing, and then it never goes back, right?
Yeah. And
that,
like most companies perform penetration testing now, but that really just gives you a snapshot of your security during that 2-week window, and then either side of that, it's the Wild West sometimes, depending on your risk management process. So this Vector Command is the first time I've seen that, like continuous 365 analysis of your footprint and protection.
Yeah, great points, Jacob, and I think that's really valuable to think about. All right, well, with that, I think that can wrap up our episode today. Jacob, I thank you so much for coming in and stepping in for Jonah today. We'll have to give him a whole lot of slack next time that we get him on the next episode. But thanks for picking up that slack there. And hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe, comment down below. We would really appreciate to hear your thoughts. And we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode of Hacktics and Telemetry. Till then.
Thanks, everyone.